Hello. In today's Principles of Computer Security lecture, we are going to be looking at classical encryption techniques. So, in the previous week, we talked about some of the basics of computer security and some of the basic threats and mechanisms and services and so on. One of the things that we identified there is encryption is going to be a key part of the security services and security mechanisms that we will be using to prevent or detect many types of security attacks. So, in that context, today we are going to look at some of the encryption techniques, mainly focusing on the classical encryption techniques. So, many of the techniques that we will look at today will give you an idea and understanding of the basics of encryption. And in the coming weeks, we will look at more modern techniques, but these are more basic techniques that will help you understand the concept of encryption and how some of these earlier versions of encryption methods used to work. The types of encryption techniques that we are going to be focusing on today are called symmetric encryption techniques. They are also called classical, conventional encryption techniques, also private key, single key encryption techniques. The key point here is in this type of encryption, what we have is the sender and the recipient. So, both the sender and the recipient are going to share a common encryption key or a common key. So, this is like you lock something with a particular key, and to unlock it you need the same key. So, that is the main point about this symmetric encryption. So, that is the reason why we call it a private key. So, the key is the one that we will keep it private, and also the single key. So, there is only a one key that is shared between the sender and the recipient. So, all the classical encryption algorithms, so all the algorithms that predated the invention of public key cryptography around in the 70s, all of them are private key cryptography or private key encryption methods. These were sort of very widely used mechanisms, and they were used from many centuries ago to even until the 70s during World War I, World War II and all. These were the types of encryption techniques that were commonly used. There are many reasons why we are no longer using these, but we will look at the modern techniques in the coming weeks and we will discuss about them in much more detail there. Today we will be mainly focusing on these symmetric encryption or the private key, single key encryption techniques. So, before going further, let's look at some of the basic terminologies relevant to encryption. So, when we talk about encryption, the original message that we intend to send, so if I need to send a message to someone else, that original message is what we would identify as the plain text. So, that is the plain text, anything that is readily readable by the user or by the sender or the receiver, that is the plain text. When we encrypt that into something that is not readable, something that is coded, that is what we call as the ciphertext. So, that is the text that is coming as a result of doing the encryption. Then the cipher is the actual algorithm that we are going to use for the transformation from plain text to ciphertext. So, using that algorithm, we will convert the plain text to ciphertext. Then we will have a key. So, that is the input that we need to give to the cipher to either encrypt, either lock the message or unlock or decrypt the message. Then encipher or encrypt is the action of converting from plain text to ciphertext, and decipher or decrypt is the reverse, that is converting from ciphertext to plain text. Then, in terms of the terminologies, further terminologies, cryptography is the field of study about encryption principles and methods. Cryptology is the study, rather, cryptanalysis is the study about code breaking, and cryptology is the combination of cryptography and cryptanalysis. So, cryptography is the study about encryption methods, encryption principles. Cryptanalysis is about how do you break encryption, how do you study about the mechanisms, but you focus on the side of decrypting things, deciphering the ciphertext, and cryptology is encompassing both of these aspects. So those are some of the basic terminologies that we will revisit quite a bit throughout this course when we are talking about the various different encryption techniques today, but also in the coming weeks when we are talking about various other different encryption mechanisms. We will revisit some of these terminologies very often. So the basic idea of the symmetric key encryption or the symmetric cipher model is illustrated in this diagram. So what we can see here is we would start with the plain text. So that is the information that we need to convey or transmit or transfer. So that is the plain text. Then we would have what is called a encryption algorithm. So the encryption algorithm is the one that is going to convert the plain text into ciphertext. And as part of converting that, it would also need a shared key that is shared by the sender and the recipient. So that would be the shared key. Then that same key will be shared by the recipient as well. So the receiving end also we should have the same key. Then for the encryption algorithm, there should be a corresponding decryption algorithm that can reverse and get back the plain text out of the ciphertext using the key. Then the main thing that we would do is whenever we are communicating something, we will be transmitting the ciphertext only. So at this point, it is not the plain text, it is a ciphertext that will be communicated. And to understand or see the ciphertext, we should have the key and go through the decryption algorithm, and we can produce the plain text output. So this is the basic idea of symmetric cipher model or symmetric key encryption. Then when we think further about the symmetric key encryption, there are two main requirements that we would have to use a secure symmetric key encryption model. The first one is having a strong encryption algorithm and then having a secret key that is only known to the sender and the receiver. So if we know the key, then we can decrypt. So knowing the key should be only the people who should know the key. Then the algorithm is the one that is doing the conversion. So if the algorithm is not strong enough, people can figure out what's happening and figure out the plain text there. So both of those are important things. A strong algorithm and also a secret key that is only known to the sender and the receiver. Then also these both parts of encryption and decryption, we would normally use these mathematical format to represent them. So that is, we would produce the ciphertext using an encryption function using the key and the plain text. And we can produce the plain text using the decryption function with the key and the ciphertext. So that is again putting what we discussed previously into sort of a mathematical model. once we have a strong encryption algorithm, once we have a common encryption algorithm known to both parties, then we also need a way to communicate the secret key across the both ends. Say, for example, if I want to use symmetric encryption, say if I want to send a secret message to you and I have a encryption algorithm that I know I'm using and you also know about that, that is okay because it is algorithm. But the key that I need to lock the message, I need to encrypt the message, and the same key that you would need to decrypt the message, unlock the message. So in that context, now we should figure out how we can actually securely inform you, how I can securely inform you about the key that you need to decrypt. Because we are sending something through encryption, because we don't have a secure channel. So now we need to have some other secure channel to exchange the key. Either we meet in person, exchange keys, and then use it for communication later on, or we have a trusted party through whom we can send this key. So, but we need to have some mechanism to share the secret key in this context. Then when we think about cryptography in general, we can talk about few different things that would define and that would characterize the underlying cryptographic system. So one is the type of encryption operation that is being used. We will again discuss about these things in much more detail later in today's lesson and also in the upcoming lessons. But the basic way of encryption operation could be substitution, transposition, and product type encryption operation. We will revisit them later today. Then it's about the number of keys that we are using. Are we using a single key or a private key encryption, or are we using two key or a public key encryption? Today we are going to be focusing on single key private key encryption techniques, and in the upcoming weeks we will look at two key or public key encryption techniques. Then another aspect that would be relevant is about how the plain text is being processed. So that is whether the plain text is processed as individual letters or streams of letters, or are they processed as block of text or block of strings. So again, you may remember the difference between stream of information and blocks of information from courses like operating system. So this is a similar concept where how the encryption is happening, what is the input is going into the encryption, is it a stream of information or is it blocks of information. So those are three main things that would characterize the nature of the encryption system or the cryptographic system that we would be using. Some of these things we will discuss today, and some of them we will revisit in the upcoming weeks. When we talk about cryptanalysis, the main objective of cryptanalysis is to recover either the key or the message. In many places, recovering the key would be much more important than recovering the message. So say if there is a secret communication happening, someone is sending an encrypted text, a ciphertext to another party. If you can intercept that ciphertext and then figure out that particular message, that is something good. You can, that is a useful information from a point of view of cryptanalysis. But if you can also figure out the key that they are using to encrypt there, then we can easily decrypt any of the messages that is going across. So now we don't need to do any more complicated analysis. We can just use that key because we have found out the key, and we can use that same key to decrypt any of these messages that are going between these two entities, the sender and the receiver. You are sitting in the middle and observing and decrypting anything because you have the key. There are a couple of approaches that can be used for cryptanalysis. One is called cryptanalytic attacks. So these are identifying the vulnerabilities, identifying the issues with the uh, uh, algorithm, the nature of the algorithm, patterns, and using that type of approach and identifying the key. Then the second approach is what is called the brute force attack. So that is where we would try out all the possible encryption keys and try to come up with one that is working. So it is like trying out all the possible keys to unlock a lock. So it is an approach similar to that. But with simpler encryption methods, with many of the classical encryption methods, particularly the simpler ones, these type of brute force attack may be a lot more practical than with some of the much more complicated encryption algorithms, encryption methods. So if we can use either one of these mechanisms, we would be able to compromise the cryptographic system and identify the key, and then we can read any of even the ciphertext without having the key, or rather because we are having the key but without proper authorization or approval there. When we talk about such cryptanalytic attacks, we can talk about number of different varieties of such attacks. So one is what is called the ciphertext only attacks. So in ciphertext only attacks, what we have is we have the algorithm and we know the ciphertext, and then we use that to identify the plain text. We only know the ciphertext and we use that to gain the plain text. The second one is what is known as the known plain text. So here what we have is, say for example in the first case, what we have is we have a set of ciphertext and maybe we know what is the algorithm that may have been used, and then we have to do some analysis to find out the plain text from that. But in the case of known plain text, what we can have is we will know some plain text. For a particular plain text, we also know its ciphertext. Say, for example, I send a message using a similar algorithm, and then I now know the message that the original plain text and also the ciphertext that after the conversion. Then now using these two things, I can do some analysis to identify how this conversion is working. So now I know the known plain text and the ciphertext, and then I can compare that and identify the key. Then, for example, another approach that we can take is what is called chosen plain text. Here we have a particular plain text and we use that to obtain a particular ciphertext, and then we do the analysis. The other one is called chosen ciphertext. Here we have a particular ciphertext, we decrypt and get the plain text and then do the analysis. Then we have what is called the select or the chosen text. So here we will either have the plain text or the ciphertext, and we will do the converse. We'll find out the converse and then use that to identify the key. Again, we will revisit this aspect of cryptanalytic attacks and how these can be done with some of the various encryption methods, techniques that we will be covering later as well. Then there are two other concepts that we need to remember when we are using encryption. That is what is called unconditional security versus what is called computational security. So when we say unconditional security, what we mean by that is with the type of encryption that we are using and with the type of key that we are using, even if we have the ciphertext, we will not be able to effectively predict or determine the corresponding plain text. So, unconditionally, it cannot be broken. The encryption cannot be compromised. Computational security is within a limited computational scope. Say, for example, this could not be broken in within a period of time, and we accept that. Say, breaking this encryption may take a number of days, and that may be a good level of compromise that we are accepting to have. So we will take that. So the calculation, the time needed for those calculation is much larger. Say, for example, it may take a number of years. So that level of encryption may not be useful to, say, for example, if you want to decrypt a network communication traffic, if you decrypt that information after 2 years, that may not be very useful. It may be useful, but in many cases, it may also not be useful. So in that type of situation, what we will have is computational security. So unconditional security is, it will never be compromised. The ciphertext could never be compromised into the plain text. Whereas in computational security, we will have certain constraints, and within that environment, it will not be compromised. So that is again 2 different ways that we can look at some of these encryption techniques, and they may fall into one or the other of these categories. Then when we think about cryptanalytic attacks, another thing that we can think is about what is called brute force search. So brute force search is, if we have a key and if we want to try to guess the key, we try out all the possible keys. Say, for example, if we know there is only 32 bits of a key, when we say 32 bits, we would know this is the number of possible alternative keys that we can have. Then say, for each trial of encryption, each trial of decryption, the time needed is this. Then we can try out that across amount of encryption that we can, or decryption that we can perform within a period of time. So this type of brute force search attack is one of the basic attacks that we can do, and it would be much more easier with smaller keys rather than having larger keys. For example, say if it is a smaller key, it is in the short order of time, but if we have larger keys, it would be significantly impractical amounts of times. So that is the main aspect of brute force search attacks. So the finding out of the key will become exponentially harder when the key size increases. Now let's look at some of the classical encryption techniques, classical encryption methods, and we will start with what is called the substitution ciphers. So the basic idea behind substitution ciphers is, if we have a plain text, so we have a plain text, and what we will do is, we'll take the letters of the plain text and we will replace them by other letters or numbers or other symbols. So it is a very simple way of encrypting information. So if we have a text, we just replace the different text with different letters of the text with some other letters, numbers or symbols. So the plain text will be say, for example, in the context of computing environments, we can also take bits of information, and then we can take these bit patterns and replace them with some other bit patterns. So we can take the plain text bit patterns and we can replace them with the ciphertext bit patterns. One of the earliest examples of a substitution cipher is what is called the Caesar cipher, and this has been used, this was used by Julius Caesar ages ago, and it has been used since in many situations because it is one of the simplest type of ciphers, but also still usable in depending on, particularly in the older ages when it was the mechanisms were not well known, they worked in many situations. So the basic idea is with Caesar cipher is we take a letter in the, say, in the English alphabet, we take the series of letters and we replace each of these letters by the third letter. Say for example, we will replace A with D, then B with E, C with F. So likewise, we will add 3 more letters. So what we will have is, say, we have A, that would become D, B would become E, and C would become F. So that is the basic conversion for Caesar cipher. So for example, if you see the example here, what we have is, say, A is replaced by D. So similarly, say M, N, O, P, E is with H. Likewise, each of these letters are replaced by 3 letters after in the alphabet. So it's a very simple way of replacing or substituting as an algorithm. So what we would have is the ciphertext or the key or the encryption, we can define it as, say, if this is the plain text, the corresponding ciphertext would be this. So each of the, once we do conversion, we will just go across this and select the corresponding letter to generate the ciphertext or the Caesar cipher. We can also use numbers, for example, and in terms of if you want to put the same thing mathematically, we can use this as the encryption function and this as the decryption function. We just take the difference and we do a mod 26 to round off the 26 alphabets in English. So that is the basic Caesar cipher. Then if we think about cryptanalysis of Caesar cipher, so cryptanalysis is trying to guess the plain text from cipher's text and also guessing the key. So with Caesar cipher, because there's only 26 possible ciphers, because we are just moving 3 letters, or maybe say we move by 4 letters or whatever, the only thing is each letter can only be substituted by 26 other letters. So A could be B or C or D, or likewise each of them can be only one other letter. So what we can do in terms of cryptanalysis is we can just do a brute force search. Say for example, if we have a ciphertext like this, we can start to replace with one of the other characters, or say we'll say, okay, would G be A? Then if G is A, then what is C? What is U? What is A? Likewise, we will go like that. Would G be B? Likewise, we can go each of the combinations and we will try to write whatever the alternatives for each, and one of them would make sense. One of them would be the actual plain text that is there. And once we crack it for one ciphertext, then we know the key, and then we can easily repeat the process to all the ciphertext belonging to the same key. So in the context of cryptanalysis, in the context of how hard it is to break, Caesar cipher is not that difficult to break once you know how it works. So because it is just shifting of letters, so it is very easily guessable, and we only have 26 rather possible ciphers, and they are fairly easily guessable using brute force search. Then An alternative to Caesar cipher, in terms of again still a substitution cipher, we are substituting one letter with another letter, but instead of shifting with the alphabet, what we can do as the cipher or the key is we can have a arbitrarily random set of letters or random order letters. So the conversion would be random. So the key itself would be a 26 letter long key. Say for example, we can use a plain text, and we can generate the ciphertext saying, say this would convert to this ciphertext. So what we have here is, in this situation, these are not in a particular order. So this is not like just a shifted alphabet. This is like just random alphabets in a random order. So then we cannot guess using that type of a brute force attack, because there can be much more combinations. So in there we only had 26 combinations, whereas with a mono alphabetic cipher where we are having arbitrarily ordered ciphers, here we can have many number of like a total number of keys are much larger. So we have a much larger total number of keys. So compared to Caesar cipher, this may seem a fairly secure option. So with Caesar cipher, it is fairly easily guessable. This may be somewhat difficult to guess. But that would be a wrong assumption because of a particular reason, that is the properties of language or the characteristics of language, and how certain letters would occur a lot in most languages. So any language you take, say for example English or any other language, there are certain letters in the alphabet that get used more, and certain other alphabets are not used very much. Say for example, if we take English, in English there are certain phrases like th or certain combination of letters are more common, and certain combinations are not very common. And in English, for example, we can analyze. So this graph that you see here, it shows the frequency of English letters appearing compared to other letters, and what we can see is E is the most commonly used letter among in the English language. So E, and then we have T, and then we have A and I. So these are like the and O. So these are some of the most commonly used or commonly occurring languages, occurring letters in the English language. So then there are certain other letters like say Z and J, K, Q, X. These are very rarely used, so we don't find them a lot in the text. So now, once we have this information about a particular language, say we are encrypting and decrypting text in English, so now we know in an English text the most commonly occurring letter would be E. The next most commonly occurring letter would be T. So that would be a fairly good guess in the context of that particular language. Once we know that information, when we need to do cryptanalysis, we can use that information to guess what is the replaced letter. Again, even this cryptanalysis technique is fairly old. That is, say, some of these cryptographic techniques, these classical techniques, were, as we said, this from Julius Caesar and like many centuries ago. This cryptanalysis technique is also an older technique that was devised by Arabian scientists in the 9th century, where you get the frequency of letters in the language. Say you take English and you say in English E is the most common occurring letter. then you get a ciphertext. There it would be different letters, but after it is being converted, another letter may be the most commonly occurring. Say, if we had replaced E with X, now X would be the most commonly occurring letter there. So then with that, we would be able to start guessing these letters, and with a bit of guesswork, we would be able to identify a particular key or a particular pattern and figure out the text as well. Say for example, if we are given this particular ciphertext. So in this ciphertext, so this is the ciphertext that we are given. So in this ciphertext, what we can observe is, so if we go and observe the texts that are available here, we can count the frequency of letters. We go and count the frequency of letters and say how many U's are there, how many Z's are there, how many Q's, S and O. For each letter we can create a frequency. Then we can see P and Z are most commonly occurring letters here. And with our previous knowledge, we would know E and T are the most commonly occurring letters in English. So P and Z could be E and T. Then we also can guess, say, ZW, the occurrence of ZW could be TH, and then because of that we can also guess ZWP could be THE, because we have already guessed P. So likewise we can start guessing different parts of the text, and once we start doing this, we can finally come to the point of actually decrypting the text, figuring out all the others. With some guesswork, some mapping and matching, we will be able to decrypt the text using cryptanalysis. So with monoalphabetic ciphers, or where we are replacing one letter with another letter, we can do that, but also these type of language-based frequency analysis and that form of cryptanalysis can be easily applied to the ciphertext, and the plain text can be guessed. Even if we have a larger key, it's still not going to help because the frequency of the text will remain the same. Then one of the other approaches that we can take to improve that is what is called the Playfair cipher. And Playfair cipher is an example where we are taking multiple letters. We are taking multiple letters and we are encrypting them as a group. So we are encrypting multiple letters as a group in Playfair cipher. So here this is an example of Playfair cipher. We would use a matrix. So here we are using a 5x5 matrix, and then we would choose a keyword. In this example we are using monarchy as the keyword. Then what we would do is we would fill that keyword in that matrix. So we would go and fill the keyword in the matrix, but the key thing to remember is if there are any duplicate letters in the word, we would skip them. So we would not repeat, we would only use the fixed number of the non-duplicate letters at the beginning of the matrix. After that, we will fill the rest of the matrix with the remaining letters, and we will use I and J, only a single letter, because in a 5x5 matrix we can have 25 characters, but in English we have 26. So we combine I and J into a single place. So if we take the example of monarchy here, we will write the first 8 letters here. Then after that we will go back to the alphabet. We'll say A is already used. So A is already used here. Then we will do B, C is already used here. We will go to D, E, F, G, H is already here, IJ together. So that's one thing, because IJ are considered single entries. IJ, then K, L, M is already there, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y already there, and Z. So we will first do the keyword. We will fill the matrix with the keyword first, and the remainder of the matrix we will fill with the remainder of the alphabets. So in filling the keywords, we will skip duplicates, and filling the remainder of the characters, we will consider I and J together. So once we have that as our key, then let's see how we can use that to encrypt and decrypt. So here the main difference between monoalphabetic and Playfair is, in Playfair we will consider two letters together for the purpose of encrypting and decrypting. So we are using them as a pair. So to do that, what we will start is, we will take a word that we need to encrypt. We will take a plain text word that we need to encrypt. So here we are considering a word balloon. So if we take balloon as an example that we want to encrypt, so if balloon is the example that we want to encrypt here, we will split that into two letters. But if there are any repeated letters, like in the case of balloon, L and L are repeated here. So L and L are repeated. So for that, what we would use is, we'll take the first one and we'll fill it with a LX. Then after that, we will continue BA, LX, LO, ON. So if the two letters are coming together, we will replace it with some filler character like X. Then after that, what we would do is, we would take each of those pairs and try to figure out a corresponding entry from this key. Again, there we will use three different methods. First one is, if both the letters are on the same row. Say for example, if we take the example of AR, A and R are in the same row. So in that situation, what we would do is, we would shift it by one letter more, and so the encryption would be, for AR, the encryption version would be, A would become R and R would become M. We would shift it in one place and rotate, wrapping back to the start. So A becomes R and R becomes M. So our encryption is RM. Then if we find something that is on the same column, if the two letters are in the same column, say for example in the case of M and U, so if they are in the same column, what we do is, we will wrap it around, but now going one below. So here what would happen is, M would become C and U would become, again wrapping around, coming back to M. So here MU would be encrypted as CM. Then the rest of the things, so things that are in the same row, we have a method. So things that are in the same row, we will use this approach. Things that are on the, if both the letters are on the same column, we will use this approach. And for any other letter combination, we will take the corresponding letters in this manner. Say we have HS. HS is the one that we want to encrypt. So what we will do is, we will take H and we will take S. So we will first read H and S, so that is B, that would be the first one. Then we would read the other one from S to H, so that would be P, so that would be the second one, so BP. So HS becomes BP. Say, for example, if we take EA, for example, we would take E, say we would take E, and then we take A. Now we take E to A, that would become rather E to A would become I, and then the other way around would be the M. So we go through the row and then come back to the column. So we first go through the row and then column. So if I repeat that again, so for the third case, what we would do is, let's take the example of HS. So we have H and we have S. So the first replacement would be, we go by row and go to the column, so that is B for the first replacement. The second one is, we go by column and then row, so that is P. So the encrypted version becomes BP. Then in the case of EA, we would start E and A. We would row by row and then we go by column. So then IJ is the first one. Then we go by column and row. Then M is the second one. Because it is IJ, we could either write it as IM or JM. So this is the basic way of encrypting, and decrypting is just a reverse of it. So instead of reading HS to BP, we would read the reverse from BP to HS. So other than that, encryption and decryption are similar operations. So this is encrypting and decrypting using Playfair cipher, which is in which we are taking two letters or pairs of letters instead of using monoalphabetic encryption. And that was done in, say, in Caesar cipher and so on. So now if we think about the security of Playfair cipher, when compared to monoalphabetic ciphers, Playfair will have much higher improved security. So instead of 26, now we have 676 diagrams. So if you want to do frequency analysis, now we can't do frequency analysis for 26 letters. We have to do frequency analysis for 676 pairs. So there can be 676 different pairs. So that is what we need to do in terms of frequency analysis. Then if we have corresponding ciphertext also, the complexity of decrypting that, guessing the ciphertext would be much more complicated. So this was a fairly, in many ways, fairly recent. This was used up to fairly recent times, even during World War I and all. This was a commonly used approach by the British and the US military. But it can be broken, particularly when you have large amount of ciphertext available to you. Then you may have enough information to go through this set of 676 combinations and trying to find out the frequency. So that's the other thing as well. To do frequency analysis, you need to have large amount of ciphertext. If you only have a single word, then you can't do much of frequency analysis. Say, if you have only a 5-word ciphertext, 5-letter ciphertext, you cannot do frequency analysis because that may be very random. But if you have large amounts of ciphertext, then you can do frequency analysis even in the case of these type of pairs. Compared to monoalphabetic, this is better, but it's still, we can compromise using some form of frequency analysis, cryptanalysis attacks. Then going from there, another approach that was developed is what is called polyalphabetic ciphers. So here what we have is, to improve the security of previous ones, here we are going to use multiple cipher alphabets. So it is going to again make frequency analysis much harder, guessing alphabets much harder. And what we do is, we would use, for the first letter of the replacement we'll use a particular key, and for the second letter we may use a different key. So each of the letters will be encrypted using different keys. So then guessing that would be even harder compared to, say, monoalphabetic replacements or even pairs. So here what we use is, we will say, we'll start with the first letter. Say if we have 5-letter word that we need to encrypt, the first letter of the word would use a particular key, the second letter would use a variation of that key, third letter would have another variation. Likewise, we'll have 5 different keys to encrypt each of those letters. So that is polyalphabetic ciphers. We'll have different variations of the ciphers to different places of letters. A simpler example of a polyalphabetic substitution cipher is called the Vigenère cipher. So in Vigenère cipher, what we have is, we have a particular way of having different Caesar ciphers or different variation of Caesar ciphers, but they will have slightly different varied versions of keys for each of the letters. So the first letter, for a particular letter, we would use a particular Caesar key for Caesar cipher, and a different letter we would have a different key for that case. So each of those alphabets will have different keys. So we will start from the beginning of the letters and we'll go through the word, and for the decryption part we will come in the reverse of that. So we can have a brief look at how a Vigenère cipher example would be done using this example here. So what we would have is, we would write the plain text. So we will start with the plain text first. Then with the plain text, we may have a particular keyword. So say this is the keyword that we have. So then what we need to do is, we need to repeat the keyword for the whole length of the cipher, plain text. So if this is the plain text is, they say we are discovered, save yourself. So that is the plain text. And what we would do is, we would take the keyword and repeat it. So deceptive, 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 and however the length of the plain text, we will repeat the same keyword there. Then what we would do is, we would use this particular table as the basis to identify or indicate the particular Caesar cipher that we would use. So this table is what we would use here. So in the case of first one, we would say that is D. So each of the key letters, so first letter is D here. So we would use a Caesar cipher for that particular key. So then likewise, for each of the letters, we would say for E, we would choose a different Caesar cipher there. So in this table, what we would do is, we would take the plain text, and in the text that is there would correspond to the columns here. So this would be selecting the column for that particular plain text, and then we would use the alphabet coming from the key to select the corresponding row. So we will select the corresponding row from the key. Now if we take the example here, so we will first start with the plain text, and the first letter of the plain text is W. So we will go to the column of W here, and we will check that column, and then we'll go to the key, which is composed of the keyword stream. The first letter there is D, so we will select the row D here, and the corresponding encryption or the cipher would be the corresponding letter between this column and row. So that would be Z here. So that is the ciphertext there. Then say if we go for the second one, the column we would select from plain text is E. So that is the second one there for the column. Then for the key, again now is E. So that would select the row E. So now if we find out the corresponding ones between these two, that would be an I. So the second ciphertext would be I. So this is the basic way we would do a Virginia cipher in terms of encrypting, and the decrypting part is just the reverse of the same thing. We can get the reverse here. Now when we think about the security of Virginia cipher, the security is significantly improved compared to the previous ones, because now we have multiple, the ciphertext has multiple letters. So each of the letters have different ciphertext, corresponding ciphertext, and the keys are comparatively larger. So the frequencies are not very visible, because at each letter may be replaced by differently in different cases. So the frequencies are significantly obscured. So say in one place A would be replaced by X, in another place A would be replaced by M. So the frequency of those patterns may not be very much visible. So that is a significant advantage, but that doesn't mean the frequency would be totally lost. That information about the frequency still would be there, because still we are mainly doing substitutions. The way we are substituting is changed. The way we are substituting is now different. We are using multiple keys for each letters and so on. But other than that, we are still doing substitution, replacing one letter with another letter. So we can still do some form of analysis here. We will first start, say we may do a frequency analysis and see if it is working for monoalphabetic cipher. If it is not, then we may think, okay, that could be a Virginia cipher. Then once we figure out it could be a Virginia cipher, then we need to figure out what is the length of that keyword. So once we figure out the length of the keyword, then we may be able to figure out what the repetition after of the keyword itself, because we use a keyword stream. So if the keyword is a particular word, we were repeating that many times to the length of the plain text. So once we know that length, or if we can guess that length, then we can use that information to determine the frequencies further, and that can form part of the attack against Virginia cipher. So in terms of attacks on Virginia cipher, there are two common or two methods that were there. Kasiski method or the Babbage method. Both are same, But because they were invented during the Crimean War period in the 1800s, I think, these were kept secrets of those governments. So these were found out independently by two different scientists and two different countries. But the idea is you figure out the repetitions in the ciphertext. So you figure out the repetition in this ciphertext, and then find the similar pattern with the plain text, and then you can do some analysis there. We are not going to go into the details of this particular method because that's not very much relevant to us in this context. But I will share some resources, online resources, which you can refer to in terms of how this Kasiski method works in terms of compromising the Virginia cipher. Then another variation of a polyalphabetic cipher is what is called the auto key cipher, and again this was also proposed by Virginia. And this the main difference with this one is we start with the key. So we start with the key, but then after that we don't repeat the key, we replace it with the actual plain text. So plain text forms the rest of the key itself. So we use the key first and then the plain text as the actual key. So to the length of the overall plain text we would have the key, but only the first part would be the key, the rest of them would be the actual plain text. Then we would do the substitutions as similar to the Virginia cipher. We would select the column and select the row and find the corresponding replacement there. So the way that we do the replacement is similar to that. Then the frequency attack, the issues of frequency attacks, and those are still similar compared to Virginia cipher here as well. Then there's another cipher that is called Burnham cipher. Again, this was in a way somewhat recent, not recent, it's more than 100 years ago now. But here the main idea is having a very large or a very long key that may repeat eventually, but within a small portion or a small period it will not be repeating. So a significantly larger key. The reason is one of the main ways that we can protect, or one of the main defenses against frequency analysis and particularly this type of substitution ciphers is having a much larger key. So if we have a very larger key, the frequency of the repetitions and so on, and identifying that type of statistical relationship using cryptanalysis would be impossible. So having larger key is good. So the Burnham cipher is about having a larger key that will repeat, but after a significant length. One of the common methods of using this type of a long key is what is called a one-time pad. So one-time pad is basically a random key that is only used once. So you have a random key, a long message as the key. So you have a long message as the key that would be random, but you can only use it once. So for any plain text and any ciphertext, there's the mapping would be 1-to-1, but you can only use it once. So the problem is how do you generate that and how do you distribute that, because you can only use it once, so you need many number of keys each time you are using to send a new message, and then how the key can be securely transmitted would become a challenge here. Then another type of ciphers compared to substitution ciphers is what is called transposition ciphers or permutation ciphers. So with transposition ciphers or permutation ciphers, what we do is we hide the message by rearranging the order of the letters. So we use the same set of letters, but we rearrange them in different orders. But still we would have the same problem of frequency distribution problem and all, because we would be able to see how they are being replaced. A simpler example of this is what is called a rail fence cipher. So what we do here is we write out the letters diagonally. So for example, if the message is meet me, so here what we have is MEET ME after the. So what we have here is we go like this diagonally and we write, but then when we are writing the ciphertext, we take it like this. We go here and here. So we go this part, then we can reverse that. So again, it's a very simpler form of rearranging the text, the same text, but we are just rearranging. But the problem with this one is particularly rail fence cipher is it is fairly easily guessable. Once you know it is rail fence cipher, then it is much more, it's very easily guessable. There's nothing complicated here. Another alternative for transposition cipher is what is called the row transposition cipher. This is a bit more complex than rail fence ciphers. So here what we do is we write out the message as a number of rows and columns. So here this is the message that we are writing. So we write the message here like this, and the remainder of the message of that matrix of the rectangle, we can add some filler characters at the end. Then the key is, so we have the plain text in this format first. Then the key is a series of numbers that will indicate which column to be read first. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 columns, and that will indicate the order. So once we put the plain text into this format, then we can read the ciphertext based on the key order. So this is the first part, second, third, fourth, fifth, 6th and 7th. So that is row transposition cipher. We write the text in rows across number of columns, and then we reorder the columns and read them in that order. That reordering order is the key here. One of the main things that we have looked so far, and one of the common patterns that we have been identifying, is with substitution ciphers and even with transposition ciphers, they are not very secure for a particular reason, that is the characteristics of languages. Because languages have certain patterns, certain letters are used more frequently, certain pairs of letters, certain order of letters are occurring much more frequently or much less frequently, and using these characteristics we would be able to make some guesses and then do some statistical analysis and then figure out the ciphertext, the plain text and the key and so on. So an alternative approach that we can take is, instead of using one of these ciphers, instead of using one of these approaches, we can make them more complex by doing 2 of them. Say we can make 2 substitution ciphers, and that would be more complex than a single substitution cipher. Or if we can do two transpositions, that would be more complex than one transposition. More than that, if we do say a substitution and then do a transposition, it would be even much harder of a cipher because the complexity will be significantly higher. So this type of an approach, having sort of multiple methods combined together, is sort of a bridge to thinking about modern ciphers. So we'll talk about modern ciphers in the upcoming lessons, but with classical ciphers, and if we can combine some of these approaches, we can go to a much more complex situation that would be much more harder to break, much more harder to guess, and in many ways more secure. And this leads to some approaches that we can use or what we consider as modern ciphers or modern techniques in encryption. So some of these combinational approaches, some of the very famous ones that were used particularly during World War II, there were which are called rotor machines. These were much complex cipher machines that were used by both the Germans, Allied, also the US and the UK, and even the Japanese had, all of them had different variations of these type of rotor machines. So they implemented very sort of complex substitution ciphers, and they would change for each letter, they would change to a different substitution cipher and so on. So these were used in that period of time, and they were the more complex version of classical ciphers. So when we think about classical ciphers, these can be seen as the most complex versions of those classical ciphers. So with these rotor machines, so with each rotor, each place, then the cipher itself changes significantly. So they change, so each of them will change one to the other as time progresses. As each keystroke will change the cipher as well. So the next keystroke will produce a cipher from a different key, so to speak. Then one last thing that we will discuss today when we are talking about classical techniques is what is called steganography. So steganography, the idea is it is not technically encryption, it is rather an alternative to encryption. And here what we do is we hide the existence of a message. So for example, here we are not obscuring the message, we are not making it unreadable. That is not the intention. We are just hiding it in plain sight, so to speak. So things like writing in invisible ink or marking in certain newspapers, you mark certain letters in with pencil. So these are sort of that type of spycraft things, or sort of modern things, technological things like hiding inside an image file and things like that. The main drawback is we need a lot of overhead to send small amount of text because we need to hide it. Say for example, if we are marking relevant text in a newspaper, we need a larger newspaper to mark small amount of text, otherwise it will be visible. You will see a lot of marks and you will figure out, okay, there's some text happening, so some steganography happening here. But the advantage is by using this type of method, other people will not know, or it may be difficult for others to guess or see that you are communicating something secretly, and that may be necessary. Because sometimes it's not that you use encryption and the other people break the encryption is the problem. Sometimes certain governments, for example, may not like their citizens using any form of encryption. So in that case, if you use encryption, then that in itself will be considered an offense, or you are having something to hide. That could be a problem. So in that type of an environment, we may use steganography, which will hide things under something else, and that may help in a certain situation. So, sort of in steganography also there are many classical techniques like say character marking or invisible inks, pin punctures on paper. So these are sort of hiding uh, these markers and things in plain sight. So unless you are looking for that, you may not see that. In modern version of steganography, things like multiple content type of files into a single file, or sometimes they may even be used in the context of distributing malware or sending viruses and so on as payloads with some other types of file, like say a video file or an image file may embed some malware in it, and then that could be distributed across. So these are some of the approaches that may be used in present day as well. So with that, our discussion in today's sort of a classical technique concludes. In the coming weeks, we will look at, we'll go into further discussions about some modern techniques and various encryption methods and so on, some of the things that we didn't cover today. Particularly public key cryptography would be a main topic that we'll be covering later. But some of the topics that we covered today would be of interest, just to know what is the basics of cryptography, how things started, and also to understand some of the things that we may cover later in the course. Then with that, the today's lesson concludes. If you have any questions on the things that we have covered today, you may leave a message on LMS, or you may send me a message. Other than that, until next time, thank you for joining in today's lesson. See you next time. Bye.